I guess you don't get too many former dentists up there, but. So first of all, I just want to say that like the evening news, some of these images you see may be disturbing. So if you're weak of heart, you may want to leave now. The other question I have for you is whether, do we have any MBAs here? Anybody that's trained on just-in-time inventory? It doesn't work anymore, at least not in this industry. You know, what we had, originally I was supposed to give this presentation last year, and it would have been a totally different presentation. Basically, I've told you about some changes in the tariffs and moaned and groaned a lot, but this year I've got some real problems to talk about. Basically, what we had in the last year was a perfect storm. You know, these problems in the supply chain came up during, peak season when everybody's trying to get merchandise in for a holiday. I've been doing this for, more than 45 years. I made every mistake in the book, I thought, until last year when I made some new ones. Because I just, these were unprecedented. So first I wanted to give you a little history of some of the mistakes that I made, and then we'll go into the causes. Last April, I had a shipment of Christmas ornaments that I needed to get, the customers, they wanted them by, May, June, July, in time for, holiday sales season, and I couldn't get space on the ship. We have a contract with Evergreen Lines, and, I kept asking for space, and they kept saying, we don't have any space. So we decided that instead of bringing a container in to Maryland the way we usually do, we found space on a container going into New York, which I thought, all right, that's better than not getting the merchandise. The container cost went from $6,400 to $20,500. The transit time into New York went from 5 weeks to 10 weeks. And then once it got to New York, sat at the, on the ship, well actually the ship sat for 12 days before they unloaded it. And then once they unloaded it, the container sat there for 12 days before it went into a warehouse at about $350 a day. And then once it got to the warehouse, they were so busy, it sat for 8 days before they could unload the container at another $350 a day. And then I had to find a trucker to bring it to Maryland. And that only cost $6,000 and took 8 more days. So it was basically a disaster that went from about $6,400 in freight to over $30,000. So that was number one. That was out of China. Then we've had, we also produce in Eastern Europe. So we do some dinnerware out of Poland and the Czech Republic. And the factory was, customers kept asking, how's the factory doing? I said, factories, they're doing okay. They're producing the ware. And then it was time to make the shipment. And all of a sudden the factory can't ship. And I said, why can't you ship? They can't get master cartons. They couldn't get cartons to put the plates in, so they just sat there for 8 weeks until they could get cartons. And then once we got cartons, of course we couldn't get space on the ship, so it took another 4 or 5 weeks. Just another pleasure. And just to let you know that it's not limited to just Europe and China, we also bring in merchandise from Thailand. And containers from Thailand they go in a feeder vessel, and the feeder vessel goes to Shenzhen or Yantian or Hong Kong, where they're loaded on the mothership to come to the States. So the Thailand factory produced on time. We got it into the container. The container actually made it onto the feeder vessel, but by that time the U.S. ports were all backed up, and the steamship line decided that they really didn't want to stop in Yantian to pick up our container. So it sat there for 6 weeks, and then we had a 10-week transit, and another disaster. So that was, those are just some examples of what was going on. I mean, you can see here that it's, we were looking for our shipment and they were somewhere sitting there. So what caused the problem? Basically, all the causes were related to COVID. We had labor shortages, there were less workers were missing work. I don't know if you remember, plexiglass between workers. Last year you had to keep your workers separated, so they weren't getting as much work done. You had people working remotely. We had reduced manpower at customs and TSA and the shipping lines. So just the whole labor situation was a mess. But then there's some things that you really didn't think about. We had in Europe, they had lockdowns in Poland or Czech or wherever. And customers would say, is that going to be a problem for us? And I said, no, it's no problem. Only it turns out that when they locked down, they shut the schools, the government mandated that, the young women, mothers couldn't work. They had to go home and stay with their kids. So all of a sudden production goes down to nothing. Then the other issues, some of the factories, especially in Thailand and in Europe, rely on foreign workers. So who would think that, you'd have a problem where the workers couldn't cross the borders? We have factories in Thailand used to bring in workers from Burma, and they couldn't get these workers anymore because of the COVID restrictions. And then we had problems with trucking. In China, you couldn't get a truck to go from one province to another province without a 14-day quarantine. So the truckers didn't want to do that. So the merchandise just sat there. There's just all these things added up. And then, there were corrugated shortages. There were higher costs for everything. Problem with master cartons. And on top of that, we had energy disruptions. The Chinese government, these are, the backups in the trucks. But this is a slide shows the cost of natural gas in China. It's not a supply and demand situation in China. The Chinese government decided that before the Olympics, they wanted to cut down on manufacturing in order to keep the air cleaner. So what they did was they raised the price. They stopped, factories from using coal. They raised the price of natural gas. A lot of the factories couldn't afford the natural gas, so they shut down production. And then, these are prices that are just set arbitrarily by the Chinese government. Then we have problems in Europe. These are natural gas prices in Europe, where because of the tensions, with the Russians, and this was even before Ukraine, the prices in Europe went up 1,000%. So as a result, the factories couldn't afford to operate. They would shut down for weeks at a time, and obviously nothing got produced. They also, in addition to that, would do brownouts and blackouts. And in the ceramic world, there's a whole process, start to finish. You pour the clay, it has to sit and it has to dry, then it goes in the kiln. But it would throw off their whole schedule as far as production. And they would have goods piling up at the factories in various stages of production, and things would just come to a standstill. So at the same time, we have all these issues. We have a shortage of space on the steamships. So when COVID first started, all the steamship lines predicted that the demand for goods was going to go way down. So what they did was they stopped spending on ordering new containers, new chassis. They took ships out of the rotation. They cut back on their workforce. And then lo and behold, all we did was sit there during COVID and just order stuff online. So the demand went way up, and the steamship lines got caught shorthanded. But instead of suffering for their mistake, they raised the price of the containers. So they've actually had record profits in the last year. So it's the one case where you can really screw up and then benefit from it. So and here's a slide just showing all these ships waiting in Long Beach. So the problem is not only did it take much longer for these ships to get unloaded, but on every one of those ships you have 3,000 or 4,000 containers. So if you multiply that by 50, 60, 80, 100 ships, you can see where our whole problem came from. And then that's compounded by a shortage of truck drivers and the fact that the truck drivers didn't want to wait 6, 8, 10 hours to go into the port to unload, to either deliver or unload a container. So we ended up with equipment shortages, lack of empty containers, no chassis to put the containers on, and transit times that went from 5 weeks to 3 months. And the fact that nobody knew what was going on or where your container was or when it was going to be delivered. And then we have some unusual one-off problems. I don't know if you remember, this was the Ever Given that got stuck in the Suez Canal. So, I don't bring in any cargo through the Suez Canal, but I had customers who would ask, is that going to bother our delivery? And I said, nah, no problem. Except that when that container ship blocked the canal, all these other ships could not get into the canal and just had to sit there for weeks. And on each of those container ships are 3,000 or 4,000 containers, which meant that those containers could not be unloaded and then reused to send goods from Europe either back to Asia or back to the States. So we got caught with several container loads of dinnerware in Europe that we couldn't load because there were no empty containers. And it took weeks and weeks for that to happen. So essentially I lied to my customers because I didn't know any better. These I just threw in because I found them online, and in case you were feeling really good about everything. The containers falling off the ship, and a lot of people heard about the ship that had all the automobiles that went up in flames, and I just thought the collision one was a little different. And then this is one of my new favorites. This is the Ever Forward, which is currently stuck in the Chesapeake Bay. And amazingly, I had 2 containers on that ship, but they got unloaded before it got stuck. Thank goodness this one got stuck leaving Baltimore and not going into Baltimore. Things happen. And if you try and cut things a little too tight, with your supply chain, bad things can happen. So with all these problems, what can we do going forward? The most important thing that I learned is to order early. You used to try and figure if you wanted stuff for holiday sales, you want to have it by like August or September, so you need to order it in March or April. Give them time for production and shipping. But shipping has not really improved. We used to have a 5-week transit from China to the East Coast, and now it's closer to 10 to 14 weeks. And if it sits in each port, so what happens is the ships will come through the canal, the Panama Canal, they'll stop in Miami, and normally would take a day to unload in Miami, but now it could take 4 or 5 days. Then it goes to Savannah, and Savannah used to take a day, now it can take 7 or 8 days. Then we'll go to Norfolk, and Norfolk used to take a day, and now it could take a week. And as you can see, it just compounds. So, order early. It's much better to have the merchandise, if things would go on schedule, to have it early. Also, you can try and contract for space with the shipping lines on an annual basis. One of the big problems when things started to get backed up was that people would try and buy container space on the spot market, and you would end up paying 4 or 5 times what your contract rate would be. And obviously that'd be good to avoid. And another lesson I learned was that you really need to communicate with your factories about things that you never thought you would ever have to ask about. Who would think that you'd have to ask the factory if they have electricity, or if they're getting natural gas, or if they have cartons to pack your merchandise in. And the factories are not going to volunteer this information. To them, it's a sign of weakness, and it's embarrassing, but I learned that you really have to ask. Do you guys be able to ship on time? You're going to have packing materials. You have gas to run the kilns. And basically, you have to anticipate for delays in all those things. Another thing that you don't think about very often is that, especially if you're dealing with China, with COVID now, certain provinces are on lockdown. If you have options to do production in different provinces, it's a good idea not to put all your eggs in one basket. One province could be on lockdown, the other one could be operating normally. So it's good to diversify your supply chain. With all these delays, there's another thing that you can do. The factories worry that they're going to produce the merchandise and then you're not going to get room on the ship. So the merchandise is going to sit in the factory, which they don't like because they don't get paid until it ships. So what we started to do with our factories is we pay them at the end of the month on whatever they've produced, whether it's shipped or not. And it keeps them in production on your merchandise. Otherwise, they're gonna, if they don't think that they're gonna be able to ship it, they're gonna produce somebody else's merchandise who may be a domestic customer where they don't have to wait for export, and your stuff can just sit around and not get produced. And the other thing that we found is that some of the factories where you really push them on price, or negotiate a little bit harder than they're happy about, when things are tight and they're short of labor, they're going to produce the merchandise that generates the most income. So you may have negotiated a good price on a big project, but if they have another project that's going to generate more income, your stuff's going to sit there. So sometimes you sort of outsmart yourself by pushing a little too hard. So I think that's about it. Anybody have any questions? It's not really a pleasant topic, but it's not going to go away. I originally thought that things would be sort of back to normal by springtime, but I'm really not seeing that happening. It's, COVID is a big problem in China and some of the other countries, and the steamship lines still don't have their act together. They're still short of space, and rates are still going up higher and higher.
So you haven't seen an improvement
No,
from a year ago?
No. First I expected I thought things right after Chinese New Year would get better because the demand would be down, but rates are still going up, and it's still taking, we used to have to book containers like 2 weeks in advance, and now it's 6 weeks in advance. And it's hard to, for these factories to know what they're going to be producing in 6 weeks. So you make a, plan, the factory produce X amount of goods, it'll be ready, end of April, but end of April comes and it may not be ready, because they couldn't get electricity, they have brownouts, the labor problems, the factories on lockdown. It's really important to just order early and try and avoid, what we had last year where we delivered one unfortunate customer several 100,000 Christmas ornaments on the 5th of January. Yeah, well, we just told them it was an early delivery for this Christmas. Which, unfortunately, they understood the situation, and it wasn't, really anybody's fault, but it happens.
Have you seen the price increase in the past 30 days because of the whole situation, or is it still developing? I mean, what if it was 25 grand, which I saw it myself,
Yeah.
which is, really hard to factor in.
Yeah, you can't figure it. Right. I mean, fortunately for us, that was a one-off situation where I just had to get this merchandise. And I outsmarted myself, and it didn't really work out. But for the most part, with our new contract, we just signed, well, it hurts to even say it, it's like $10,900 for a container that a year ago, or maybe 15 months ago, I was paying $4,000 for. But I've heard of rates, well over $25,000 if you need to buy a container on the spot market.
Yeah, I don't do it in advance. So
Yeah,
I'm gonna have to change because that's a killer.
Yeah, and I've had friends call me and say, can you hook me up with your forwarder? And the forwarders don't even want to take new customers right now. They can't even satisfy their existing customers. So, it's a tough situation. The factories seem to be doing a little better as far as production, but the shipping is still a disaster.
Yeah, so you use forwarders. The best training we had at Faro, and it was mostly Europe, was the C.H. Robinsons of the world coming in and helping us at both ends, because we found out we were causing half the problem by demanding something.
Right. So with the steamship lines, it's all about revenue. So if you have a contract, for a while last year, our contract was at like 6,400, which I thought, things are bad, but I can handle that. But we found at 6,400, we weren't getting any space. We would have to wait, 4, 5, 6 weeks to get a container loaded. And when the rate miraculously went up to like 9,500, we didn't have to wait so long. But the way the steamship lines work is they try and maximize the revenue on every ship. So if they have a choice of taking, a container at 20,400 or 10,200, they're going to load that other container first. And they won't admit it, but that's, when you're playing golf with the sales guys, they will admit it. But technically and officially, they won't admit it. But that's what happens. So if you really need the merchandise and the space, negotiating too hard on the rate really doesn't help you any. Sure.
You mentioned Thailand. Have you got any insight into the GSP status?
No, I think so far Thailand is still most favored nation. There have been a lot of companies that have shifted production from China into Thailand. We've been in Thailand about 30 years. I really like the Thai manufacturers. The Thai people are, very nice to deal with. They have somewhat limited capacity because you're not getting a lot of new ceramic or glass factories there. And a lot of people are trying to move stuff out of China because of the punitive tariffs that President Trump put in. And, the Biden administration is making some noise about, expanding those tariffs to additional items. So we'll have to watch and see what happens. Sure.
So do you have contracts directly with the shipping lines, or do you work with forwarders?
No, we have a contract directly with the lines, and sometimes it gets kind of crazy because let's say I've got a load that I need to get out of Yantian in China, and my contract is at right now 10,900, but I can't get space. I can go to a forwarder, and I can get space for 12,000. It's on the exact same ship that I'm trying to get with, but it's just it's a crazy system, and it's really annoying that a lot of this problem was actually caused by the steamship lines, and that they're benefiting and reaping the rewards of their mistake. But it is what it is. So. Sure.
Can you share a perspective on the recent on the 301 tariffs exclusions that just recently came out?
Yeah, I haven't seen too much on that yet. I've been, well, here's another scary thing. Our forwarder and our broker was just recently hit with a ransomware attack. And this is a big international company. They were basically out of operation for 3 or 4 weeks, and then we couldn't clear any shipments. They couldn't issue delivery orders. It was a disaster, and I haven't really had a chance to follow up with them on these new tariffs because they've been sort of out of commission. Just something else to worry about. All right, that's it. Enjoy. Thank you.